I want to just clarify though. That's fine, we can keep going with it. So I want to make sure that we get to the point of, you know, are you, I mean, from the sounds of it, you two are supportive of going forward, I guess. Yeah. Okay, I just want to clarify that, just so we get that out there. Okay. Julie? You wanna-
Yeah, you mentioned earlier you want to frame the conversation, right? So I am sitting here listening. Thank you for educating us on things that we have not been a part of. But yet, as a new board member, I spent time with the FLIRP. One thing that I have heard, I don't think it's all about devices. I think there's that perception out there. I probably was guilty of it. I think I asked some questions early on in this process about how, like, tell me where these devices have been, but clearly we don't have enough, or we don't have the right devices. So it is about devices, but I also think that we need to be careful. I looked back at, we'd seen a presentation before, 15, 16, 17, 18. We've been spending about, depending on how you categorize it, 3.5, 3.6, 3.5. I hear that number as like that's the shell of our technology needs. So I'm comfortable with that number, especially relating it back to Morris Leatherman saying people would be possibly okay at 10 to 12, but that gets us closer to $15 or $16. I would be careful to go any higher than that, just because I've seen that in the history of our spending. Is it going to be enough money? I mean, is there ever enough money for technology and learning? But I do think that if we've had a lot of time to talk about the pandemic and what it's done to districts in the state and the entire country, but if we go back pre-pandemic, our technology needs were probably just scraping the surface. So for me, I think I would be comfortable at that. I don't think I would ask for any more. I know that most people in our community, me included, don't pay attention to something until it's either broken, especially a device. I work, and when it's broken, I'm like, oh my gosh, how do I do this? As a personal, I am an iPhone, iPad user, but I have a Android family member. They don't communicate very well, simply, and so I understand what these teachers must be going through. But for me, I just think that, you know, and even Marcus, his staff is amazing. I appreciate all their information that they've put together for us. You know, I just don't think there's ever enough to support the technology needs, but if it can help push us in the right direction, I would be fully supportive of that, if that's what the community wants.
Okay. Amy?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, but I'll just say I was happy to hear that the survey results were more positive than they've been in the past. I think that speaks a lot to what people are ready for, and also what the pandemic has taught them about technology. And, you know, they're probably thinking more about and ready to be more educated about how it pulls from the general fund and what that looks like. Given that, yeah, I think we need to define the terms, and I think Marcus and his team are going to help us do that in a great way. And then we got to educate people about why it's important. To your point, I think 3.5 is kind of the midpoint, and historically speaking, it makes sense for us. But I'm not married to that number at all. I think it's just a good starting point logically. So yeah, that's my feedback.
Okay, thank you. Enrique?
I'll make my comments brief. Yeah, I support the technology levy, and I think 3.5 million makes good sense as a starting point, especially considering the feedback we received from the community survey. 3.5, taking a look at the most recent May 10th board meeting and the data that was, okay, maybe I'm not going to make it brief. Looking at the data that was presented by Ehlers as far as the midpoint and what that breakdown would be, that threshold for monthly payment seems to fall in line with respect to the midpoint and majority of the households that were surveyed to fit within that $12 to $15 per month range. So that seems to be an appropriate starting point.
For me, the past several years of budget numbers have been in that 3.5 neighborhood. So to me, that is a starting point for the conversation. The numbers from Ehlers in the past couple of weeks, combined with the survey results tonight, would actually, I'd start the conversation there, and I would consider more. Not a lot more, but keeping the tax impact within what seems to be something that the community can support. 3.5 to me is starting point for the discussion. My little epiphany, I guess, for myself tonight, just a talking point that I will use as we discuss this, is people say schools are getting all kinds of money. Schools got money just like you got a stimulus check. How much do you have left? I mean, it's just, that's simple English, right? It's not going into great detail, but I think it's something people would understand. We got a stimulus check, and we used it on the stuff we needed to use it for, and it's gone. And I also, frankly, I think it will be critical for all of us to be united in this support for whatever we decide to go out for. I would hope that it sounds like we have pretty unanimous support. I think that'll be a very, very critical thing to be able to show the community that we as a board support this effort. Those are my comments.
Okay. I think everybody's made some really valid points. You know, I think one thing to take into consideration too is that we are 2 years in now of cuts. We've cut approximately $5 million from our budget already over the last 2 years. So our funding issues, you know, it's definitely a need funding. I mean, and this is an avenue for us to be able to have additional funding. And our technology needs, like Julie said, pre-pandemic were a stretch, as it was already. We had old iPads. I mean, it was a push when we had to get all those things out and use all those things for every kindergartner to, you know, every elementary school, that there were issues. And so, you know, I think we do have a story to tell here. And Mary, I echo your comments about, we do have very educated parents who, and families, I mean, and residents in general, who are supportive of our schools. And I think if we start this process and get our information together about, you know, what is our need, where is our funding? Because if you look, I mean, and I think we've kind of alluded to this, if you look at the graph of districts that are getting funding, I mean, Bloomington, 9.5 million. I don't think I mean, so what is technology? I think that is going to be really the kind of the question around this, because technology obviously is a thread through everyone's lives now. And so I think making sure that we keep ourselves, I would say 3.5 for me is a pretty comfortable spot. I mean, given the survey results, given that, you know, we have moved from tax hostile, we're still tax sensitive. So I don't want anyone to like get their, you know, yay-hoo. It's still, you know, it's still convincing people that we're asking for more money. So, so yeah, I think we need to be sensitive to that. But I do think we have a few years here where we can tell a story that there is funding issues at the state. When I started to sit in the seat 11 years ago, education was 50% of the budget. Now it's 40%. So it's a dwindling amount. And I'm talking statewide. So, I mean, that just shows you that there has been a gradual overall decline of funding to education as a whole in the state of Minnesota. And so we can only rub two fruits together to get, you know what I mean? We can only do so much for so long. And so, I fully support, going forward with this. I would be supportive of looking at, a 3.5, right around that $15 a month for our average home. I think that puts us in at least according to the survey, it's something palatable, I think, to families. And given what we've gone through over the last year, I think they'll understand the importance of it. So that's what I feel like we have a majority voice here of people feeling like that's, and I think bringing back a presentation that represents that shows us what is 3.5. If it's staffing, I think some of those ratios that were in the May 10th, I'll be interested to see what the updates are. We were 1 to 600 basically for students. That was the highest. Some places are 1 to 200, kids. So I think staffing wise, that's a big piece. I think security is a big piece. As far as something that we could look at too. And obviously, I think a big theme that's kind of come forward, and Mary kind of alluded to it, we need keyboards of some sort. I've kind of said that for a while. I know they're expensive. I have one myself for my own iPad. They're not cheap, so I know that. But I do think keyboards are essential. But I'll be very interested to see what comes forward. So, all right.
So to be clear,
Yep.
I'm hearing direction on us bringing back on June 14th at the regular board meeting, a recommendation and plan for a tech levy at the amount of $3.5 million. Okay. Okay, thank you. We will get to work on that tomorrow. I do know we have a FLRP meeting, I believe, June 2nd. So we will see what we can get accomplished between now and then and continue to work with board members on some information there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And I think next up is our final preliminary budget with Julie.
Good evening, Board Chair Ruel, Dr. Stallo, board members. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about the budget again.
Right on cue, Julie, right on cue.
Next one over, Julie. Next one over, Julie.
This one?
Yep.
Oh, thank you. So we're going to talk about the budget. As you know, when we work through our budget process, it's definitely based on our strategic direction and our goals, our mission and vision for the district and our children in the district. I did want to talk again about our 5-year enrollment history. You can see that we are, as of May 17th, our enrollment in the district is at 8,642. We budgeted 8,663, but I want to caution you that we have kept some of our students for part of the year. And so when we did our first preliminary MARS report for the year end, which is very preliminary, but we were slightly over 8,700 students. So that means that some of our students, although they have left, we were able to count them for part of the year that they were here. It's not like if they were here for half of the year, we get to count them for half of the time. So as you can see, we've lost students, but the amount of time that they have been here has been significant through the year. So we are those, when we count an actual ADM, the amount of time each student is here, we're over that 8,700. So I'm hoping that we will come out just slightly ahead of where we budgeted for the current year. So I wanted to caution you that even though this is the number, we do get to count those students for part of the year. This is what the board has talked about for enrollment projections. We decided that we, as a district, that we would see an increase of 188 students. I do have some good news concerning our enrollment for kindergarten. We're only about 12 students behind where we were this time last year. So we've made some significant gains over the last couple months in terms of that. It's mainly our resident students that are still kind of lagging to enroll into the district. Our open enroll is pretty stagnant. It's about the same as it was last year. And so we are seeing, and I'm sure that's because parents just still aren't sure what's going to happen next fall, and so they're waiting. And we did some surveying again of our students that have left our district, if they're attending another school district or private school, if they would be returning. Those numbers aren't quite as positive for that return as we were hoping for. And so we're still kind of waiting to see. I'm very hopeful if we were to return in full session next year as more towards the normal side, that we would see that increase again. But I think it's, again, a waiting game for all school districts in the state of Minnesota to see how that return will happen. So we have budgeted for 8,851 students for next year. It's this line right here for 21-22. That's K-12. So that's what we are budgeting. Our enrollment, as you know, most of the revenue budget comes from enrollment. It's based, all of our projections are based on enrollment, so that's why enrollment is so important for us to kind of be on target with that number as we work through that enrollment process. So we are estimating a 0 on the base formula. Many of you have been following the legislature, as have I, and it seems like they've allocated some funding, and we're hoping maybe we'll get a 1%, and so that will adjust this number, but we aren't going to know that number until after the board has approved the preliminary budget. And I always say this is very odd, and we just don't know what our enrollment is. All our revenue is based on enrollment. We don't know what our funding from the state is going to be, any additional funding, I should say. We have a base idea of what our funding is definitely going to be. So you're making a lot of assumptions when you're starting this preliminary budget. And so I just want to remind people that this isn't, that we are basing our revenue on those assumptions, and it's not on actual what we know what will happen. And so that's why we always come back in December after we know what our enrollment is in October, what our actual enrollment is, and we look at any additional changes in the legislature. And I really am hoping that we get done with that work in June so that we don't have to wait into next year to get that funding.
You mean the legislature?
Yes,
Yeah.
the legislature.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. I just wanted to divert a little bit there. We are seeing an increase in special ed revenue, and that's based on current law of that 4.5%. The board did agree to an additional $400,000 in achievement and integration revenue, reinstating our lost revenue from the current year, gate receipts and those types of things. ESSER 2 funds that we are using as one-time funds for next year of $683,000. And we also have to reduce the COVID funds that we've already utilized this year, $2.8 million. And then our expenditures, we've talked about this, the right sizing of our staff, our administrative reductions, realigning some of our staffing. They were being expended to just the general fund, and now they're being expended to some of our achievement and integration goals. Some additional staffing aligned to achievement and integration. Reassigning stipends and our staff costs to staff development. We've saved some funds, and I should say saved, and I want to say that very carefully because staff development is what we call a restricted fund. And so we didn't spend that fund totally this year. And so we were able to do, again, a one-time reassignment of some of our stipends to staff development to save in the regular general fund. And then substitute teacher pilot at the high school. And again, we had that same reduction of COVID expenditures of that $2.8 million. I do want to talk about our COVID funding. This has been a question I've heard you earlier tonight talking about, and people not understanding that COVID, how we're getting COVID funding and why we're getting it and how much we're getting. And so I did add a few slides in here today to try and update you on the latest and greatest that we're hearing in terms of COVID funding, but also how have we been, how much money have we received and where that's going. And so we have received, and you can see the list, we've received some county funds early last fall. we received about $260,000 in county funds. GEAR is the government's emergency fund, and that was $78,000. ESSER, the original ESSER funds, which is elementary and secondary funding, $170,000, and there's several different categories. So the ESSER 90% is $184,000. Those were our first original revenue funds that we had received. And we have until, I believe, 2023, I could be wrong about that, it could be, but to spend those funds. But we have actually, by the end of this year, we'll have spent the majority of these funds down, simply on these, especially on our DLA teachers, or distance learning, additional staffing that we had, our monitors, Tier 1 childcare that districts were required to have. Those were the things that we had to spend these funds on. So we had several mandates for school districts that we just had to do. We didn't have the funds to do them. They allocated these funds for us to do that type of work, and so that's where that was spent. It wasn't things that we could really utilize our current budget on, and it's really small dollar amounts. If you think about in terms of our budget for our general fund is $105 million in revenue. These are very small dollar amounts in comparison to our total budget. Now, the CRF funds, that was I felt a significant amount of money coming from the federal government to our district, $2.1 million. That was quickly spent. It had to be spent by December 30th of last year, if you recall. And so that's the funding that we spent on additional technology to help us get over this hump of some of our older technology being out to our students. And so we did use a significant portion of that.
And that had to be something that wasn't in our budget.
That had to be something that was not in our current budget. That is correct.
Okay.
We also used that for DLA teachers because that ended in December, Tier 1 childcare. So we tried to really space this and use, because that had to be spent first for Tier 1 childcare, technology, all of those things. We spent all of that on Tier 1 up until December 30th. And then we used the GEAR ESSER that was ongoing for these January through May for those expenditures. So we were marrying those two funding sources together to help us get through this year. So our estimated additional federal funding, let me go back to this first piece again. So that funding was based on our 2019, 18-19 title, or free and reduced lunch numbers. Our estimated ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 are based on the current year's numbers. So October 1, so we had fewer students. Fewer students were applying for free and reduced lunch because they were receiving free lunches. And so
Because everyone didn't everybody? I mean, couldn't have everyone gotten free lunches?
Yes.
Isn't that correct?
And so they didn't need to apply.
So they didn't do apply, yes, that's what was my point, yeah.
Yes, and so those numbers actually, the original numbers that came out were based on, I should reframe that, were based on 1920 numbers, and then they reallocated them based on the current year. Which, so I think I brought to you, we were over almost $800,000 in the original ESSER 2. You can see it was reduced to 683.
Yeah.
Our original ESSER 3 was somewhere around 1.7. We're down to 1.5. And so it did really make a difference as well. For our ESSER 3 funding, 20% of those funds have to be used for learning loss. So about $300,000 of that. And the other part, we haven't really talked about it because we haven't received that, but we need to make an application like we have in the past to MDE, how we plan to spend those funds. And we'll be doing that and working through that in the next couple months here to see what the best use of those funds are.
Haven't these been being kind of held too? I mean, the 2 and the 3, they've been waiting for our legislature, correct?
So, right, and I'll talk about that as we go through a little bit. But yes, they could not allocate the ESSER 2 funds until the legislature was finished in May. And so they just held, the Senate held on to that, and so we really couldn't allocate
Well, they
those
could
funds.
have if they would have agreed to it.
If they would have
earlier.
agreed,
Okay.
but they did not
Just to
agree.
clarify.
Yes, thank you. So I did a little of those three components that I just talked about. Federal funding, COVID comparisons per pupil. I took some of the same schools that we've compared to previously and said, how did we fare as a school district compared to those districts that we compare ourselves to all the time? And again, you can see we receive $540 per student compared to, if you look at Burnsville, I mean, $3,200 per student. So a lot of school districts, and we've been talking, and I know we've been dealing, like my association, Minnesota School Association School Business Officials, we've been working hard with MSBA, MASA to say, this really isn't equitable. People in our communities are saying you've gotten all of this money, but it's not equitable across all school districts because it is based on your socioeconomic student population. And so, we have been struggling to have people understand that and how that is. And again, it is one-time funds. These are ongoing expenses that the district has. We're receiving these funds one time and then they're gone. We don't get them again next year, so.
Can I just clarify on just on this?
Yes.
So, federal COVID, so that, so it relates to the actual funds? So is that,
That would not be the county funds, it would be the
Okay.
GEAR and ESSER.
And the
CRF.
okay, so it's those funds, okay. I just
And
want-
the ESSER 2 and 3.
Yep, so
So
anything
all-
that says ESSER, CRF.
Right,
or
it is
other
not the
ESSERs.
county funds, but it is all
Okay,
others.
I just want to clarify.
Julie, is it fair to say they use the same algorithm that they use for the regular distribution? So like you mentioned, free and reduced lunch, all that.
It's based on title allocations.
So it's the
So-
algorithm based upon need.
And it really is based upon that. And so, for the school districts like Prior Lake Savage is saying, you know, that we have less need, I don't think that we would be able to say that. We have less need than someone else. Yes, we may have parents, but that have a little bit higher economic status. However, our student population still has a need, and as a school district, we still have a need that's greater than $540 per pupil unit. It certainly doesn't make up for the loss of enrollment our district had this year, and how we were required to spend the funds certainly didn't make up for that either.
Well, other districts lost money. What I'm trying to get at is, I mean, there's compensatory funds that is in the general fund when we get that money distributed. Everyone gets a base rate, and then after that, it's dependent upon that algorithm of like free and reduced lunch, English language learners, all that. Is that what this was based upon? Because, I mean,
So Title is a federal program. Title I is a federal program. Compensatory is a
understand that.
state program. Title is based on each school, individual elementary, middle, high school, the population in their school building and so we have some elementary schools that don't even qualify for Title funding. And so,
right, that's what I'm getting.
This, I think this would, I mean, this hurts us harder than the actual Minnesota formula. Do you know what I'm?
I get that.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is, but it looks almost, if you look at the gradient, especially at the end where you see Burnsville, it's very similar. It's not the exact same formula, but it's very similar to it.
it is.
Because otherwise, if you look at this without an explanation, it almost looks like the federal government doesn't like our district compared to, and that's not the case. I mean, it's based upon the actual count of students in certain categories, right?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. So I just wanted to bring this up just to show you again how our district isn't receiving the same, and it's not equal between school districts. And you know,
Right. I mean,
as far as funding,
I mean, I can see somewhat why they did that, but,
absolutely.
and, you know, obviously the formula is the formula, but you get down to the fact that you're dealing with a pandemic, and there's sunken costs, no matter if your free and reduced lunch is 40% at one school or 60%, you still have to clean it, I mean, there's a lot of things involved.
And those
So-
are the conversations about, should there have been a baseline
Yeah.
that was equal? And then certainly, there are different families and different needs that different districts have based on demographics. But to Julie's point, the loss of enrollment
Right.
that all districts experienced
Was not,
doesn't.
it
right.
doesn't show in there.
Right.
And then that starred point at the bottom there, is that for all, what is the 456 out of 476? We were 456.
So there's, out of all the districts, including public and charter schools,
Okay.
there's 476 public and charter schools.
Okay.
So we were almost at the bottom again in
We were at the
terms of
bottom
revenue
20.
received for these funds.
Yeah, to me, that paints a real brutal
Which
picture.
did special ed play in that formula, do you know? It didn't at all?
No.
It's, I just disagree with how they did this, but okay.
Right,
Go on.
as Dr. Stella said, a baseline would have been much more palatable to school districts. And I think that's why there's a lot of school districts that are on, like us, that have received very little. But as you can hear, the legislature said, but you're getting all this money, you're getting all this money. Well, there's proof is here, like, no, we really aren't getting all of this money. And the money that we did, our big chunk, had to go for certain expenditures and had to be spent within 4
December.
months.
Right.
So it was just it's just an interesting,
But would it help in the education of the public if we actually put exactly where the money went to on the website to dispel that particular assumption?
I mean,
we certainly have all that information. We could categorize, like X is technology, and a lot of it was technology. It was making sure that we had curriculum, online curriculum.
the only thing I would say, I mean, I get that point, but then it's almost like you need to have it in context. Because,
Well, just put the accounts on there and the categories of the accounts and what the vendor was, because I mean, that's all that's really needed. I mean, they could tell right away if 500,000, 600,000 or whatever went to Apple and we put iPads in everyone's hands, that's a key number.
Yeah, I think as we move forward, especially when we come back to you in June, we've certainly heard tonight that one of the themes that we're going to have to help educate our community with is millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars of federal funds. Our amount of that, our proportion of our budget of that is incredibly small. So we certainly that is, I think, a really important education piece to talk about. Julie has it laid out, and we could have in there right next to what she just showed us in that previous slide, what some of those expenses went for. I mean, I don't even know that you've talked about PPE yet, but we certainly had lots of expenses around that, and the enhanced cleaning and all of those things.
I think this is I think this is really an important point that people see this.
Well, and I know that, and this is hard to quantify.
Right.
As far as how much extra cleaning did we do?
Yeah.
And, how many extra, and we, I've already asked, looking for, how much additional overtime did we have for our custodial staff, and how much additional sub-time did we have, simply because people were out on leave as well. So trying to staff it, you're paying people on leave and hiring additional, none of that comes from the COVID funding. That's all general fund expenditure. So, there are additional expenses as well. There are some savings, we've talked about that. But as we've kind of looked through our expenses, we've had some additional expenditures simply because of the requirements that we've had as well. These are new, and so that's why I quickly put them in. Some of this information I just got today, technically. So the governor decided to use some of the flexible money that the state of Minnesota received in the ARP, the American Rescue Plan dollars, for programming that will support academic enrichment and mental health. And there's some very specific ways that you have to spend this money as well. Our allocation is $248,000, and it has to be used to expand mental health and well-being to support youth and adolescents attending summer school programming. Partnering with community businesses and organizations to develop summer mentoring enrichment programming. Bringing school-based summer programs into the community. So instead of it being maybe in a school, it's out into the community. And providing students with summer field trips for hands-on learning opportunities. So again, this is mainly relating to summer school and opportunities for students to receive enrichment programming throughout the summer. And it's really late for us to get
I
that
was just gonna,
information.
Julie, I was just
the
gonna
current
have
year.
you, I was just gonna have you state again when we received this number.
Today.
Exactly, and obviously, we have had to have summer programming in place, enrolling kids, doing those things right now. The good news, as you see on the screen, is that, you know, even if there aren't specific needs that we're able to use that money for this summer, we will be able to use it next summer.
So this funding is allocated based on 40% of our ADM, average daily membership, and then 60% on that concentration of our underserved students. And this has an emphasis on students needing special education services for summer school. And then in addition, there's an extended learning summer program, and that just came out in the last week. And so this is our summer school programming. Our allocation is $195,000. And if you read this, this is summer school programming, in-person academic learning opportunities during the summer taught by a licensed teacher. And so they cannot be used for online programming, extended school year, community ed programming, or childcare services. It can be used for additional summer staff, I should have been specific, transportation, which we will definitely use that for, and longer or increased days. We typically have a 3-hour day. I think I was having a conversation with Assistant Superintendent Holmberg about this, and we're having a really difficult time finding teachers. Our teachers are really are burnt out. That's the easiest way I can say that. And so to think about taking on 4 weeks of summer school, I think is daunting for them right now. And so we're looking at ways, can we have them do 2 weeks and 2 weeks over here, you know, instead of the same teacher doing 4 weeks. We can try and get additional teaching staff. But we're really struggling this summer to find staffing even for our current programming. And so this is additional funding, but we need to be able to find that teaching staff to be able to do it. This is available until next September of 2022. So we'll be doing a robust summer programming next summer, definitely, but it is very late in the year in order to offer this programming for the current year. I'm sure we'll find ways for additional field trips and those kinds of things for our students. So I just, you know, in my mind, as I work through the budget process and I think about Prior Lake City School District, I already showed you the graph about the limited revenue that we received in COVID funding. You look at our operating referendum comparisons, we're at the lower end of that graph as well. And if you look at our technology, which you've seen already, we're at the lower end of that graph. And so, and we've always talked, we educate our students for $2,000 less. And this is why. I mean, a big portion of why is we just don't have a technology levy. We have a very small operating referendum. And so when you compare us to other districts of like size or our neighbors, you can see that we we're just not getting the same kind of revenue opportunities as our neighbors are. And I when we talk about our tax hostile district or tax sensitive now, the reasoning is because we have very little industry in Prior Lake Savage School District. And so the majority of that expense for any of these technology or operating goes directly to our homeowners, where districts with a much larger business base, it's much easier for them to pass these operating and technology levies, and they're able to do a much larger amount for less cost to their homeowners. And so that equity piece in our district, between districts, it just isn't the same.
I just want to ask a clarification question. When a district has more business in it, that means that the city doesn't extend as much of the infrastructure taxes to the individual homeowner. So they still pay the same amount if they pass a school levy of any kind, but their overall tax burden is less. So the impact to the individual homeowner is much less. Is that a correct statement?
The impact that is less, correct, to the individual homeowner.
Because there's a larger business base.
Because there's a larger business base, and that business takes on that tax burden that our homeowners are having to take on.
Yeah.
We've seen this slide before. Again, this is our revenue comparison. So if we're talking about revenue per pupil, in 2018 and 19, Prior Lake Savage School District was receiving the funding, had just received funding from that recently passed operating referendum. We were ranked 241 out of 300 school districts. Now we've slid back to 256 in the current year. This is our general fund budget. You can see that there's a lot of different areas of which our funding goes for the total general fund budget. We have our unassigned, which is the biggest portion of our general fund budget, which is majority of our teaching staff, administration, and all those expenses, transportation, and those types of things. We do have some what we call assigned for different areas that we have kept those dollars there available for those specific purposes. But as you know, as a board, you can always reassign them back to the unassigned portion. You can see that I've added in the $683,000 of COVID relief funds. And then we have our Q-Comp, or our alternative teacher compensation, of $2.3 million. So for a total really unassigned general fund budget of about $97 million. And then we add in the restricted areas. And these are, by law, restricted for these specific purposes. And there's the list that you can see. We talk about staff development, our area ALC and targeted services, which is our summer school. So you can see that expense going up this summer. Now with this allocation, we'll see if we'll get some additional revenue there as well, which isn't included in this budget yet. And so I'll need to work through that. And then, learning and development, gifted and talented, these are very specific areas of which long-term facility maintenance, operations, that the district still needs to run and operate our district. So overall, our revenue is about $105 million. Our expenses are $108 million. So we're still not quite at a balanced budget. Our unassigned fund balance would be about 8.5%.
How much?
8.5%.
Okay, which is kind of what we had planned.
Right, what we anticipated, correct. Again, this will change, with these factors that we know still are waiting out there as far as terms of the legislature not being finished with their work yet. A lot of times when they do finish the work on time, I'm able to enter that and get that information updated into our budget, but this year I'm just not able to do that. And then all other funds. So these are the other funds that we have for our district. Our total food service fund. This has changed significantly because, again, for next year, it's a free lunch through the whole next year, except it will be at our high school, will not be because we're no longer on the federal food program. We have community education. At the last board meeting, we did make a fund balance transfer in there, and so we are reflected that. They may making changes with that, so there may be a few tweaks yet for the community ed budget for the final preliminary budget. But they are working really hard to promote their programming and to increase that fund balance for them as well. You can see our building construction fund is down to zero. I think we have about $5,000 maybe left in that fund right now. And so we're almost done with that. We still have LTFM funding that we're paying for our Grainwood building. And we have some work left to be done there that we still are holding on to those funds. Our debt service fund, that's for all of our bonds. And you can see that pretty much takes care of itself. And our custodial fund, that's for any fundraisers we've done. We've utilized that very little this year simply because of our school situation. Our internal service fund, that is our health and dental insurances. And That has increased again this year. And then our total revocable trust is our OPEB. It shows as a negative there. And I just want to remind you at the bottom, I did add in our estimated assets are really $8.2 million. But our auditors are requiring us to show that unfunded portion of the total OPEB. So even though that we do have assets of $8.2 million, we still are unfunded, technically, $3.6 million. We'll never have to fund that $3.6 million. I just want the board to know, and the community, if they're listening, to know we don't have to fund that, because according to our actuarial study, that's the implicit rate subs piece of it. We're fully funded as part of the actual expense of this program.
Super confusing that we have.
It
to do
is
that
super
now.
confusing, and I'm sorry about that.
Years later, we have to change it. Yeah, I mean, no one likes to see a negative number.
No, but we are, and that's why we added that at the bottom to say
Yep.
that we do have the funding there, and we do have assets in that area. Any discussion?
I would just say thank you for your work. I appreciate your patience, I guess, as far as we, moving on with what the legislature's doing. I know it's always kind of this weird in-between land that we live in as we wait. So I appreciate, all the work involved and you hanging tight here and getting us the most information that we can. So thank you.
Julie, I do have a question. I'm still concerned about enrollment and our ability to make up for the difference. It looks to me like our in-district enrollment went flat or negative going before the pandemic and going into this year, and we're heavily dependent on open enrollment, and I'm not sure if they're the most transient or how much we lost, because I don't think, have we cracked close to 8,000 in district yet? I don't know that, and I'm also a little concerned when you talked about we're only 12 behind on kindergarten. And you only mentioned kindergarten, and that just rang a little red bell in my head, going, where are we with middle school and everything else?
So we're behind as far as middle school, 6th grade. We usually see a big increase there. We're behind in that number. We're behind in grades 1, 2, 3 than we anticipated. Our high school is doing well for the most part. They're at their budget, I believe, already. But it's our middle school and elementary that aren't. And again, it's hard for me to predict this, and I agree. I'm concerned about our enrollment. I think everyone here is concerned about our enrollment for next year. I've had a lot of discussions with other business officials in other districts about what's happening in their districts, and they're seeing very similar results, that the parents are just waiting to see. And some are saying, I'm going to keep my student where they're at. Some are saying, I got to wait, I'm waiting to see. I'm going to see how you're coming back this fall. As quick as they left last August, I'm hoping maybe if we know we're coming back in session as quickly as they'll come back. I can't say that, though, and that's one of the reasons why we did what we did with budget reductions and made sure that we're actually staffing for the actual number of elementary students that we have right now, and not for what we're projecting to have in the fall.
But we are behind then on our normal open enrollment, either re-upping or in general are usually have a huge leap in 6th and 9th grade.
That's not open enrollment. Those are students coming from Aspen, St. Mike's, coming into.
That's where they're coming from?
Yes.
Okay.
That's not open enrollment in 6th and 9th grade. That's resident students coming from those two.
So when we kind of went flat before the pandemic, and we did increase open enrollment quite a bit, and also because we had the extra buildings, did we see the same trend, or what happened?
Where do you show us going flat before the pandemic? Because on the graph, it does not show that.
No, it's the percentage of OE versus regular. So in in 2019, 2020, we only grew.
So you're talking open enrollment?
Yeah.
You're not talking
Yeah.
enrollment?
No, I'm talking, because,
Just to be clear.
right.
We had limited significantly open enrollment over
No, not in 2019, 2020, we actually.
I think we've spoken to that before. When we had limited open enrollment the years prior, we knew it would take a while for people to, number one, hear and trust that we were actually open to open enrollment, and others who might have been worried that, are we going to close it down the road? Are they going to be allowed to stay?
I'm talking about the difference between in-district, and I just wanted to know if we're at a greater risk because of that, the difference. So in-district enrollment in 2019, 2020 only grew, according to the state and according to the numbers you've already released before, only less than 0.5%, and where we grew was in open enrollment. And I'm wondering what the impact will be on our projections with this crazy pandemic year going into the next year. And if we're going to, because it seems like a significant portion of our growth is meeting those OE numbers, and that's what I'm asking.
In the past, it hasn't been open enrollment growth. It has been resident growth that has been our driving force. We have had open enrollment. We limited it because our resident was growing so quickly. And that's my analogy of what's been happening in the district. We did have in 1920 less resident students enrolling, and it really was an anomaly because we've been consistently having 200, 250 students growth in our district, and it's been our resident students. And we do have some growth in open enrollment, but it's the delta of residents in and residents out. And so we may have more resident students staying in our district instead of going out. That helps our district, the more students that can stay in our district instead of open enrolling to a charter school or to another public school nearby.
I understand that. I'm just curious. I didn't know if that was a particular concern, given the growth trajectory. And if you're not necessarily concerned over one or the other, then I'm fine with that. I'm just curious.
I think we're seeing consistent open enrollment numbers. Kindergarten's pretty consistent from last year. Our residents are only 12 less, so I'm saying that's pretty consistent again from this time last year, which was pre-pandemic, or it was still pandemic now in May last year, but we still had enrollment. And so it's still coming in, and we were seeing that growth. And so I think those are pretty good trend numbers that I would make that comparison to. Did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
The only thing I'd make note of too is we were fairly conservative in our projections of putting 0 on the formula
Yes.
for this budget. And it looks like we probably will get something, so that will help as well.
It will help. 1% on the formula, though, is about $600,000.
Well, it's better than nothing.
It's better than nothing. Absolutely. It is better than nothing, and I will take that.
Yeah.
I don't want people to think 1% of $100 million budget is,
Right.
It's not $1 million. It's
Right.
definitely only about 60% of our funding is base formula.
Yeah.
Julia?
Go ahead.
No, I appreciate all the updates this evening, and especially the conversation about enrollment, because certainly that's something, and I agree, every superintendent I talk to, that is their major concern as well. And to your point of, I do think there are a lot of families that are waiting to see that the masks and what happens with masks, what happens with any kind of restrictions or safe learning plan. And what we've been told at this point by the commissioner is that at this point, we will be opening with no restrictions. And so to your point, as quickly, hopefully, as they left, because they had to, because they needed consistency, families did, in 5 days a week. They wanted to be someplace maybe where the masks weren't. We understand that, and understand why some families now, to Julie's point, we've been calling families to find out what they are planning for next year. And families that had moved a child and then are not going to move them back, we understand that. But hopefully, as we know more about being back in person, they will come back. And remember that they have to enroll. I think that's the other part of the message that our elementary principals, and I know your staff are saying, is just to remind those families to enroll. So this is a reminder.
And I do want to let the board know as well that we are, there's some additional flexible COVID funds out there that the governor still hasn't allocated. And so one of the things that MASBO is doing is we are also working with MASA and Minnesota School Boards to ask for some one-time help for the loss of funding for enrollment for school districts. Now, again, it's just a one-time, but they asked us for our needs, and they did a survey from MASBO about what our school districts needs, and that was one of the biggest needs to help us offset that loss of revenue. And so we're hoping that maybe, even if the legislature won't give us additional funding in that area, maybe the governor will hear us and divvy out some of those flexible funds for that purpose. So we are definitely advocating for that as well.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Do we want to talk about COVID?
Oh, yes.
Costs?
I forgot the other part. That's kind of a cool little chart I saw.
Yeah.
That was interesting. Is that coming up?
It's on here, if I can show you. Oh, it is here, okay. So, this really is it's not going to be very good on the screen, so it's probably best if you look at it on your devices. But our state aid revenue shortfall for our district, you can see, is at almost $2.5 million. One of the things that we don't really talk about is the loss of Levy, because it's always a couple years behind, and this is the adjustments that we do when our student population changes from year to year. So it's really important for us to update those Levy numbers and enrollment numbers as quickly as we can so that our Levy information is correct. But we'll see about $500,000 of negative Levy adjustment in the coming year because of that negative enrollment. And then self-funded, because we're a self-funded health insurance district, our COVID-19 screening and vaccination costs were almost $1.5 million. And so when you think about increasing 6.11% of our health insurance, part of that comes from this COVID expense to our self-funded health plan. And then our estimated reduction to miscellaneous local revenues, about $500,000. Our unemployment costs, this is a hard one, and I've said $1 million, and I've really talked about this. We, one of the districts that did make some layoffs last year, we still have not received a bill from unemployment. So we're making a big estimate on this, so I could be off. There's a lot of discussion on who's paying that bill, because it shouldn't be the school districts, which we then levy to our taxpayers. Because it's a COVID expense, it should be covered by those costs. I think there's a lot of discussion right now, will it or won't it be covered? And that is why we haven't received a bill yet. For last year, we're 4 quarters behind, I believe. I know. It's not just us.
Not just you.
It's not just school districts, but that's how far behind it is. And that's why it's difficult to say, what will this cost be? So that is an estimate, and I want to make sure people understand that. But we do need to have a number, and if I was to, in normal times, that would be a conservative number. It'd probably be more than that. But I just don't know what they will do with that COVID funding, if they'll cover this unemployment cost or not. So our personal protective equipment, enhanced sanitation, school nurses, socially distanced transportation, their health. We talk about all that when I had it in the budget, that $2.8 million. So our total, $8.7 million for additional COVID, just related to COVID. And then the relief, you can see the federal relief packages we have out there, $3.5 million. We did get some additional aid because we're a declining enrollment district for the first time of $306,000. It certainly doesn't offset the $2.5 $1.4 million that we lost on that first line. Estimated field trips, student entry, travel, cost savings, $370,000. Substitute teacher cost savings, about $250,000. So a savings about $4.4 million. So you can see that we're about 4.2, almost $4.3 million. That's the number we've been talking about for our district here. Our ESSER 3, again, you can see that allocation is about $1.5 million. And so whether, there's not a number there because there hasn't been a decision on how we're going to use those funds. And so I didn't know if we were offsetting them and using it to offset those expenditures, or if we had a need somewhere else that we really felt that should be used for. And there hasn't been that discussion because we haven't been allocated the funds yet. So we're still kind of having that discussion about how can we use those funds and then what's the best allocation for those funds. And then there's some notes down there about what we've done with food service, community funds, and those kinds of things for your reading pleasure.
Good information, though.
Really good. And we can certainly put this on our website if you feel that would be something that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think.
I think this does a great job of going full circle for the last several hours into, you know, what that perception is, and then here's the actual impact, even though it's estimated, and I know that's what's always, you know, we don't have the full numbers on some of this, but it certainly shows that, while we are grateful for those funds, there's still not enough.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie.
Got it. Madam Chair,
Yes, that's right.
may I suggest a
Yeah,
3-minute recess?
I was gonna say, it's been 3 hours, so let's take like a 3-minute break.
Okay.
I was gonna ask, and I just saw people going, so I thought, okay.